I was 10 when I first heard of Joan. My father was a farmer, much like hers. In the evenings, after a long day working in the fields, he would gather us by the fire and tell stories of the countryside. Tales of old kings and forgotten battles. But there was a new story, one that was spreading through the villages like wildfire. A story of a girl from Domremy, not much older than me, who had been called by God to save France. My mother, who had always been pious, crossed herself every time her name was mentioned. Joan of Arc. She must be a saint, my mother whispered one evening. To see visions like that, Saints Catherine, Michael and Margaret, guiding her, I was captivated. A girl, barely 17, destined to drive the English out of France and see the Dauphin crowned king at Reims. I imagined what it must be like to be touched by God, to be chosen for such a task. For the first time, I felt that perhaps a girl could do something extraordinary, something beyond what the world expected of us. These were dark times for France. The 100 Years' War with England had dragged on for decades, leaving our country fractured and weary. The English occupied vast swaths of our land, and the Burgundians, once our allies, had turned against us, siding with the enemy. The people were desperate, clinging to any spark of hope in a world overshadowed by conflict and suffering. Many believed that the English occupation was a divine punishment for our sins, while others saw it as a test of faith. It was in this climate of uncertainty and despair that Joan's story began to spread, a story that promised deliverance. By the time I turned 14, news had reached us that Joan was gathering an army. The village was abuzz with excitement. I knew I had to see her for myself. I begged my father to let me go. At first he was reluctant. War is no place for a girl, he said, but eventually he saw the determination in my eyes. If you must go, then go with God, he said. He gave me his blessing and a small bag of provisions, and I set out for Chinon, where Joan was rumoured to be. When I arrived at Chinon, the city was alive with activity. Soldiers, merchants and common folk filled the streets. I made my way to the castle where Joan was staying, trying to blend in among the crowd of onlookers. As I pushed through the throng, I caught my first glimpse of her. She was not the towering figure of my imagination, but a slight, determined young woman in armour. Her hair was cut short like a boy's, and her eyes held a fire I had never seen before. Later, I would learn that the Dauphin, Charles VII, had tried to test her by dressing as a courtier and placing another in his stead. But Joan saw through the ruse. She walked straight to him and knelt, addressing him as the Dauphin. When he protested, she simply smiled and said, "You are the one God has chosen, and he has sent me to you." That was all it took. The court was abuzz with her divine certainty, and so was I. I found work in the kitchens, serving bread and wine, but my eyes were always on Joan. I watched her from a distance, saw how she moved among the men, always with that same calm confidence. She was a shepherdess, yet here she was, commanding knights and speaking with nobles as if she had been born to it. One evening, while serving at the feast, I caught her eye. She called me over. "What is your name?" she asked. "Jeanne, mademoiselle," I stammered, taken aback by her presence. She smiled. "Jeanne, would you like to serve France?" "Yes, of course," I replied, not quite sure what she meant. "Good," she said, "then come with me." From that day on, I became her attendant. I helped her prepare for meetings, brought messages to the commanders, and listened intently as she spoke of her visions and her mission. I could see the men's faces, some filled with awe, others with doubt. Not everyone believed in her divine calling. Some thought her a fool, others a witch. But there was no denying her effect on the people. Wherever she went, hope followed. During the siege of Orléans, I saw Joan in her true element. She moved among the soldiers, speaking words of encouragement, lifting their spirits. I watched as she led them into battle, her banner held high, her voice clear above the chaos. When she was wounded, I thought she would fall, but she merely gritted her teeth and pressed on. "France needs me," she said, her voice steady even as blood seeped through her armour. "God is with us." The siege was lifted 9 days after her arrival. It was a miracle, or so everyone said. And perhaps it was. I had never seen anything like it. The men fought like they had the strength of 10, and Joan was at the centre of it all. She was our beacon, our guiding light. As the victories continued, so did the skepticism among the higher ranks. One night, I overheard a conversation between two of the commanders, Robert de Baudricourt and Jean d'Orléans. "She is just a girl," de Baudricourt grumbled. "What does she know of war?" "Enough to have lifted the siege," d'Orléans replied, his tone thoughtful. "Perhaps there is more to her than meets the eye." "She is a shepherdess," de Baudricourt snapped. "We are knights warriors. This is madness." But d'Orléans shook his head. "Madness or not, she has God on her side. I have seen it with my own eyes." As the campaign continued, we marched deeper into enemy territory, Joan always leading, always confident. At Patay, we defeated the English forces, and the road to Rheims lay open. When we reached the city, the gates were open to us without a fight. The coronation of Charles VII was a sight to behold. Joan stood by his side, her eyes shining with triumph. For a moment I believed, truly believed, that God had sent her to save us. But as the months wore on, the victories became harder to achieve. Joan's unyielding faith began to rub against the realities of war and politics. Some of the nobles began to turn against her. They saw her as a threat, a symbol of power that did not belong to them. Rumors spread, whispers of witchcraft, of heresy. One cold morning, as we prepared to march on Paris, Joan turned to me. "Do you believe in me, Jeanne?" she asked. "Of course, my lady," I replied. "I have seen what you can do." "But do you believe?" she pressed. "Truly believe that I am sent by God?" I hesitated. I had seen her lead, seen the victories, but I had also seen the fear in the eyes of our enemies, the bloodshed, the suffering. I don't know," I admitted finally. She nodded, as if expecting my answer. "That's all right," she said softly. "Not everyone does. But God is with us, Jean. I know it in my heart." Our campaign on Paris failed, and soon after, Joan was captured by the Burgundians. I was not with her when she was taken. I had been sent back to Rheims with a message for the king. By the time I returned, she was already gone, sold to the English. The trial was a travesty. I managed to gain entry to the courtroom, disguising myself as a scribe. I watched as they paraded her, shackled and bruised, before the tribunal. They accused her of heresy, of witchcraft. She answered them with the same calm resolve she always had, but I could see the weariness in her eyes. "Do you believe you are in a state of grace?" one of the judges demanded. "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God keep me there," she replied. They tried to break her, tried to make her recant. For a moment they succeeded. I saw her, broken and exhausted, whisper the words they wanted to hear. But then, days later, her spirit returned. She recanted her confession, stood tall, and faced her accusers with defiance. When they led her to the stake, I was there, hidden in the crowd. I wanted to scream, to stop them, but I knew it was futile. She stood tall, her eyes lifted to the heavens, and as the flames rose around her, she called out to Jesus. Her voice was strong, unwavering, even as the smoke choked the air. I could not watch. I turned away, tears streaming down my face. Joan was gone, but the memory of her remained, a beacon of hope and faith that would never fade. Years later, when I think back on those days, I still see her standing tall, her banner flying, her voice clear above the din of battle. She was not just a girl from Domremy. She was a warrior, a saint, a legend, and I was there by her side to witness it all.
Enjoyed traveling back in time with us? Don't miss your front row seat to history's greatest moments. Subscribe now to join us on more adventures and be the first to experience the stories that shaped our world.